Good morning, Jeremy.
Now, we have been talking a lot over the past, year, probably year and a half, I'm not sure how long ago now, we started talking about some of the people on the Warrnambool Pioneer Board, hearing their stories behind it. And, of course, in the process of doing that, we've talked a bit about the board itself, but not a lot about the board itself. But, a few weeks ago now, perhaps a couple of months ago, it came back in its newly restored form. I'm sure you're all thrilled to see it back and officially welcomed. But this morning you wanted to tell us just a bit more about, the history of the board itself.
Well, yes, it's interesting you mention a year or a year and a half, because that's about how long the work has taken to get it restored after, perhaps it might even be longer than that, since we decided that the work needed to be done. But there is a bit of a story behind that, I suppose. There was a fellow called Edward Wiedler who came to Warrnambool back in the early 1900s, and he was a fairly dynamic sort of guy, and before we knew it he was involved as secretary of the Progress Association and involved in lots of groups. He was really a bit of a go-getter, and by May 1907, he'd composed a 90-page history of Warrnambool, which was 100 views of old and new Warrnambool. Now, there'd be lots of people who'd lived here for a long time that might have thought, that wouldn't be a bad idea to do, but Wiedler got up and did it, which was really pretty impressive. And he also suggested that there be a board to celebrate the pioneers, the very early people that came to Warrnambool and the district, who built the foundation on which we all sort of live and benefit now, I suppose. So it was the Diamond Jubilee he was looking to celebrate. So I think he talked about it first in about May, and the Diamond Jubilee was in July, and the board was finally finished and presented to the Art Gallery in 1924. So it was got to be a bit slow moving. Part of the reason for that could have been that Wiedler himself left Warrnambool again. He was off doing other things, but before he went, he got the ball rolling. He got people who were descendants of the early pioneers to try and find photographs or portraits of the pioneers. They, of course, had to pay to go on the board. That was really the problem. That was the reason that it didn't get finished for so long, because not everybody paid up when they should have done.
Right.
And
Do we know, just to distract you for a moment, sorry, but do we know if everybody who's on there, did they all pay in the end, or did some sneak through without fulfilling that?
I don't know that we quite know that, but I think that perhaps the people who originally were supposed to go on and their images were worked on by Lillian Foyle, who was in partnership with her brother Charles, was a photographer in Liebig Street. And she was really a very highly skilled artist who could enhance photographs and create likenesses from very little information. I think there is some suggestion even from observance or description. And so she was the one who'd done the work, and I presume that after the work had been done, they probably didn't discard that. But there was a public appeal at the end, and that was what got it over the line. But as I said, it took until 1924 before it went to the art gallery.
Right.
But, of course, people were fairly enthusiastic about it at that stage. I mean, it was what you might call one of the things that communities did. But then fashion changes, and over the years the board was not discarded, but it was less highly valued, and it had a variety of homes. Sometimes it was on public display, sometimes it was hidden away. Was demounted, then it came back into its quite ornate timber mount. It's a pretty impressive thing. It's 3 metres by 2 metres. It's got a carved wooden frame around it, a golden slip, and then the images of 204 men, and some very early watercolour images of Warrnambool.
Yeah.
So, it is a pretty impressive thing, and it was last in the public space when it was at the library, but in front of that there was a big big range of DVDs. You could see the top row of gentlemen and perhaps the heads of the next ones, but really not at all accessible to the public. And so in 2014 it was moved to HeritageWorks.
Right, okay. And then you took it off, of course, to be restored.
So when it arrived at HeritageWorks, we were pretty excited about it, and people were very enthusiastic about being able to see up close and personal their descendants or people that they knew about that had played a big role in Warrnambool. But then we could see the fragile state of the board. And some of the images of the men had bowed and looked at the back, and they really, it was in a pretty terrible state. So we got a grant from the council, from the Community Development Fund, and had a specialist consultant prepare a report about the significance of the board. And it, if I could just quote from that, it says the Pioneer Board of Warrnambool and District on a board, and its contents are of historic, artistic, research and social significance at a local, state and national level. So it really is, I think it's big. It's pretty much intact, and it was still being used, which was good. But we got a quote from the Grimwade Centre for Cultural Material Conservation at Melbourne University, and that was nearly 50,000. So we had, of course, the inevitable fundraising, but we've had the work done. It's been really good. I mean, I could go on to describe all the meticulous work that was done, and it was complex, and it took several months to do. But we've got it back now. We're delighted. The images and the watercolours have been stabilised, and the mount's been cleaned, and the overall impact is of a very much revitalised, vibrant work, and it still pays homage to our past. It's not perfect by any means. It's, a bit like all of it. So I've got a bit of a sag across the middle. You could, well, you can imagine that a piece of card that's almost 3 metres by 2 metres with 209 holes in it, which sort of impacts on its integrity, is fairly difficult to keep upright and whatever. But we're certainly really pleased the boys are back in town, and people are pleased to be able to come and research, to see the photographs, research them, and we're now doing a book.
Oh, good. All right, which I'm sure we'll talk more about when that comes out as well.
Yes.
Are there notable exceptions as well, though, do you think? Are there people who we know who've played some part in Warrnambool's past but who are not on the board because their families weren't here or they couldn't be contacted, they didn't cough up the money required at the time?
Yes, I think there are, and possibly it would depend on whether the families were still in the district in 1907 when that happened, whether, of course, they didn't have an image.
Right, yeah.
Because we're talking about, going back 50 years from that time at least. And there are some people on there that perhaps had a fleeting influence in Warrnambool, others that went on to great things. But of course we've talked about those men over the past 18 months, as you said. Some of them have really been players in the state and national sphere.
Yeah, I was wondering if there should be, if you've got a case to make an alternate board now that that highlights some of the people who aren't on the Pioneer board.
I don't know that we need to spend 17 years on that.
It'll be much easier and quicker to do today, surely.
I would think so, yes. Yeah. And probably what we would say was, right, money up front or you're not even considered.
Oh, that's still a factor then. Right. Glenys, thank you.
Thank you, Jeremy.